السيدات والسادة المشاركون والحضور والمتابعون على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. باسم المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات أرحب بكم في مستهل أعمال الدورة الثامنة من منتدى دراسات الخليج والجزيرة العربية. هذا المنتدى الذي أطلقه المركز العربي في ديسمبر من العام 2014 ليكون منبرا أكاديميا متخصصا في دراسة شؤون منطقة الخليج العربي وقضاياها السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية. يجمع الباحثين والدارسين لشؤون منطقة الخليج العربي وعلاقتها بجوارها والإقليم والعالم. وقد استمر هذا المنتدى دون انقطاع رغم الظروف الصعبة والأزمات السياسية والصحية التي واجهت المنطقة خلال السنوات القليلة الماضية، فلم يؤثر ذلك على الاهتمام به ومستوى المشاركة في فعالياته. ومنذ إطلاقه عام 2014 عقدنا 7 دورات للمنتدى غطت في طروحاتها الإصلاحات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية في دول مجلس التعاون، وقضايا التعليم والتنويع الاقتصادي، وأزمة حصار قطر، وموضوع التحولات الاجتماعية، وإشكالية الهوية والقيم في دول مجلس التعاون، وصنع السياسات العامة، وأمن منطقة الخليج في بيئة متغيرة، والعلاقات الخليجية الأمريكية. تناولنا في دورة العام الماضي التي عقدناها افتراضيا على منصة زوم موضوع الصناديق السيادية وسياسات الاستثمار في دول الخليج العربية، والتي تبينت أهميتها خلال جائحة كورونا وانهيار أسعار النفط. وكذلك تناولنا علاقة دول الخليج العربية بإيران. نتابع في هذا المنتدى أو في منتدى هذا العام مواكبة القضايا والتحديات التي تواجه دول منطقة الخليج العربي، ونتناول موضوع استجابة دول الخليج العربية لجائحة فيروس كورونا المستجد، السياسات والتداعيات، بوصفه موضوعا أول في محور القضايا الداخلية. نناقش المصالحة الخليجية آفاقها وانعكاساتها على السياسة الخارجية لدول الخليج العربية وعلاقاتها الإقليمية والدولية، بوصفه موضوعا رئيسا ثانيا في محور العلاقات الدولية. تتوزع جلسات مسار استجابة دول الخليج لجائحة كورونا على موضوعات وقضايا متصلة بتأثير تفشي كوفيد-19 وانهيار أسعار النفط على دول الخليج العربية، واستجابة حكوماتها في قطاعات الصحة والتعليم والاقتصاد، وأبرز الدروس المستفادة وغير ذلك من قضايا. أما مسار المصالحة الخليجية آفاقها وانعكاساتها على علاقات دول الخليج الإقليمية والدولية، فيركز على خلفيات المصالحة وانعكاساتها على علاقات دول مجلس التعاون الخارجية ومواقفها من أزمات المنطقة. أعتقد أن كلنا نتابع ما يجري حاليا، وهذا جزء بطبيعة الحال من تداعيات المصالحة التي بدأت مطلع هذا العام، أو التي حصلت بالأحرى مطلع هذا العام. يتناول المنتدى هذه الموضوعات في 28 ورقة موزعة على 12 جلسة، يقدمها 30 باحثا من منطقة الخليج والمنطقة العربية والعالم. بسبب الظروف التي فرضتها علينا جائحة كورونا، اقتصرنا هذا العام على دعوة من يرغب من المتحدثين في الحضور شخصيا، ولم نقم بدعوة ضيوف المنتدى كما جرت العادة، على أمل أن نعود في منتدى العام القادم إن شاء الله إلى الحالة الطبيعية في دعوة جميع المتحدثين والضيوف. الأخوة والأخوات، على مدى الأعوام ال7 الماضية جرى تكريس هذا المنتدى باعتباره أحد البرامج البحثية المتخصصة في المركز العربي. يعقد في الأسبوع الأول من شهر ديسمبر من كل عام، طبعا أحيانا نقدم أسبوع أو نؤخر أسبوع بحسب الظروف، وتحول إلى ملتقى أكاديمي متميز يحرص الباحثون من المنطقة والعالم على المشاركة فيه. وقد شارك خلال الدورات ال7 الماضية، إذا أضفنا إليهم دورة هذا العام، ما يزيد عن 300 باحث ينتمون إلى 120 مؤسسة جامعية وبحثية حول العالم، وتتوزع جنسياتهم على نحو 40 دولة، قدموا أوراقا بحثية في مختلف القضايا. صدر عن هذا المنتدى مجموعة من الكتب التي كانت عبارة عن نتاج الأوراق البحثية التي قدمها الباحثون خلال الأعوام القليلة الماضية. أذكر منها على سبيل المثال لا الحصر: بلدان مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية، التحديات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية، قضايا التعليم وتحدياته في دول مجلس التعاون، التنويع الاقتصادي في دول الخليج العربية، العلاقات الخليجية الأمريكية، هواجس السياسة والاقتصاد والأمن، والتحولات الاجتماعية في دول الخليج العربية، الهوية والقبيلة والتنمية. وهناك مجموعة من الكتب أيضا قيد النشر والتحرير. نحن نشكر لكم حضوركم وإسهاماتكم، ندعوكم للمشاركة في جلسات المنتدى ونقاشاته. وأنتقل بكم الآن إلى الجلسة الأولى من جلسات المنتدى، وهي بعنوان المصالحة الخليجية، الخلفيات والتحديات المحتملة. يشارك فيها زملائنا الدكتور ماجد التركي، الدكتور عبد الله الشيجي سيكون معنا عبر زوم من الكويت، والدكتور ماجد الأنصاري والدكتور عبدالله الغيلاني، فليتفضلوا مشكورين. شكرا. الجلسة الأولى من منتدى دراسات الخليج الدورة الثانية، وعنوان هذه الجلسة المصالحة الخليجية، قراءة في الخلفيات والتحديات المحتملة. معنا في هذه الجلسة كما ذكرت 4 من الإخوة. على يساري الدكتور ماجد التركي، سأعرفهم بطبيعة الحال بالترتيب. الدكتور عبدالله الشيجي معنا أيضا سيكون من الكويت إن شاء الله عبر منصة زوم، الدكتور ماجد الأنصاري والدكتور عبدالله الغيلاني، فمرحبا بالجميع. أبدأ هذه الجلسة مع زميلنا وصديقنا الدكتور ماجد التركي، الذي يقدم مداخلة بعنوان المصالحة الخليجية والتحديات المحتملة لمسار التقارب الخليجي. والدكتور ماجد التركي هو رئيس مركز الإعلام والدراسات العربية الروسية في الرياض، وعضو في مجلس إدارة المركز الوطني لأبحاث الشباب، وعضو الأمانة العامة الدائمة لمؤتمر زعماء أتباع الأديان كازاخستان، والجمعية السعودية للاتصال والإعلام. له العديد من الكتابات المنشورة في مجلات علمية محكمة على العلاقات السعودية السوفيتية. حاصل على الدكتوراه في العلوم السياسية من جامعة موسكو في العام 2004، والدكتوراه في العلوم السياسية من جامعة المآتا في كازاخستان في العام 2002.
أنا سعيد اليوم بعودتنا للمنصة مباشرة للقاء والتشاور والتباحث العلمي والبحث والأكاديمي مع زملاء أتعلم منهم أكثر مما أقدم إليهم. الموضوع الذي بين أيدينا موضوع حقيقة مقلق، وإن كنا نتحدث عن المصالحة وجدا ومربك حتى لمجرد الحديث، لأن الوقائع بمستمسكاتها لا تزال مرتبكة. المشهد في تطلعاته والتأملات لا زال غير واضح. طبعا احتراما للجهد البدني والذهني والمالي والعلمي الذي قام به المركز، كان لزاما أن أقوم بإعداد ورقة علمية وفق معطيات بحثية أكاديمية حتى تكون من ضمن المرجعيات للمؤتمر. فأعددت ورقة من 25 صفحة، لا تنزعجوا لن أقرأها. أنا لا أحسن القراءة إطلاقا، أنا إنسان أكتب وأعد، ولكن للأسف أني لا أحسن حقيقة القراءة. حاولت البارحة أن أتجرأ على نفسي وأن أكسر هذه العادة السيئة، يعني أحاول أن أقرأ شيئا ما مكتوبا أمام المتحدثين. فعشت البارحة بكل جدية قلقا ذهنيا لم أعتد عليه. حينما حاولت أن أنزل للواقع وأنا أراجع الورقة، وجدت أننا ونحن نحرر علميا نستقل ونكتب ونجد مسارات ومداخل، ولكن حينما نعود وننزل إلى الواقع ننصدم. خلونا آخذ فرضية المصالحة، أنا لا زلت أعتبرها فرضية ولا أعتبرها واقع. خلونا نأخذها شكليا في هذا المؤتمر. أطراف الداخلة في المصالحة دول الإمارات، البحرين، الأطراف المراقبة حتى نقيم المصالحة هل هي واقعية شكليا. فقط في هذه الندوة نجد أظن 6 من الزملاء من الكويت، وأنا 3 أو 4 من عمان سعيد جدا بهم. لا أحد من الإمارات ولا أحد من البحرين ومحددكم من السعودية، بمعنى أن ثم أن مصطلح المصالحة لا زال يعني غير مكتمل. هو في تقديري هو تفاهم أو انتكاس قطري سعودي أو سعودي قطري. المصالحة، مفهوم المصالحة الذي نتأمل فيه لا زال بعيدا عن عام 2017 في الأسبوع الأول من الأزمة كنت خارج المملكة حينها حقيقة، وكنت في تحويل رحلة في أحد الفنادق، تابعت المشهد، مشهد بداية الأزمة، انفجار البلون. ودائما أنا حتى وأنا أدرس طلابي كنت بعيد نوعا ما حاليا في الحياة الأكاديمية، دائما استحضار المقدمات مهم لاستيعاب الوقائع. إذا حاول أن تتعامل مع الوقائع وتغيب المقدمات الأساسية لا تستطيع أن حاولت أن نسترجع المقدمات للأزمة. تذكرت حينما كنا في حالة انبهار واندهاش وارتباك، ارتباك حقيقي. فأذكر في الأسبوع الأول حينما وصلت إلى الرياض بعد الأزمة من غد طبعا أو بعد غد، كنت على قناة الجزيرة، وهو آخر لقاء كان لي مع الجزيرة حتى يوم الجمعة. بارك الله فيك. سألتني المذيعة قالت: ماجد، هل تتوقع بهذه الأزمة أن تنفرج يعني قريبا؟ قلت حينها وتجرأت على أن أقول هذا الكلام لأنني لست إنسانا متشائما، يمكن أكثر مما أضر به هو مساحة التفاؤل التي، فقلت بتقديري إطلاقا لن تنفرج هذه الأزمة قريبا، وإن انفرجت فلن تعود بنا كما كنا. لماذا؟ قلت لأن ملفات الأزمة متناقضات غير متوافقات ووضعت في حقيبة واحدة، فلا يمكن أن تعالج هذه الأزمة وهي في حقيبة. إذا فكت هذه الحقيبة، فتحت هذه الحقيبة، أخرجت هذه الملفات، فسوف نستطيع أن نتجاوز الأزمة. وهذا ما حصل ولله الحمد في قمة العلا، أن سحبنا ملف السعودية وقطر ولا يوجد شيء. وأنا قلت في وقت حينها على قناة الجزيرة، وهذا موجود ليس ادعاء، من عاد في أظن شهر جون بداية الأزمة موجود في اليوتيوب. فالحمد لله أن هذا الملف العجيب أن ورقتي موجودة، ورقتي بكامل تفاصيلها وفق المعطيات التي ينتظرها الإخوة الزملاء، موجودة في 25 صفحة، ولكنها حينما رجعتها تألمت كثير، لأن حينما نزلت إلى الوقائع لم ورقة وعدت قبل شهرين أو 3 شهور. حينما نعود إلى الأزمة حتى نعرف أننا لسنا في أفق المصالحة. المتطلبات الأساسية التي وضعت في تلك الحقيبة نوقضت في الأمس وقبل الأمس وفي الأسبوع الماضي. كان ملف مثلا الإخوان المسلمين، كان ملف العلاقة مع تركيا، كان ملف العلاقة مع إيران، هي المحركات الرئيسية أو المعوقات الرئيسية في قضية الملف الخلاف. ما نراه في الأسبوع الماضي يعني يحدث لك نوعا من، ليس مجرد ارتباك، يحدث لك نوعا من القلق في المنهجية في التفكير. طيب إذا نحن مضينا يعني بهذا الاتجاه، فلماذا هذا الخلاف من أساسه وليس في حالة من الحال؟ لذلك أنا أقول حتى نخرج من هذه الإشكالية يجب أن نلغي شيء اسمه المصالحة الخليجية. نلغي هذا المصطلح كليا لأنه غير متطابق مع الوقائع، وسنلهث خلف سراب لا يمكن أن نصل فيه إلى شيء. يجب أن نبحث لنا عن مداخل أخرى غير مفهوم المصالحة الخليجية. لأننا إما أن نصطدم بعثرات لا يمكن تجاوزها، أو أننا سنحاول كسر إيرادات لا يمكن أن تكسر. خلينا نكون صريحين، يعني من وضع هذه الملفات في هذه الحقيبة هو من نقض. هل ستكسر هذه الإرادة من أجل أن تقول نعم أنت ادعيت وكذا؟ إذا نحتاج إلى مسار آخر غير مسار أو مصطلح آخر غير مصطلح المصالحة الخليجية. القلق عندي الآن في تصوري في قضية التحديات، خليني أنتقل إلى التحديات حتى نأخذ من فضاء. طبعا مشكلتي أنني المتحدث الأول، فلا بد أن أمهد إلى قضية المصالحة، فلذلك اعذروني على هذا الكلام التلقائي. التحديات التي ستواجهها المنطقة في هذا الفضاء، سواء في فضاء المصالحة، في فضاء اللامصالحة، في فضاء المصالحة الثنائيات. نحن الآن دخلنا في مرحلة جديدة في تقديري في منطقة الخليج تحتاج منا وعيا آخر مختلف، سواء في تحول في المسار من مسار القوى الدولية بالذات الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية إلى إنابتها إلى حاضنة إيران إسرائيل. ووجدنا أنفسنا مقصورين على التعامل معها، بمعنى أن مصالحنا المحلية العربية التي اصطدمت بالمصالح الدولية ما قبل الربيع العربي فأثمرت الربيع العربي، الآن تحولنا إلى درجة أسوأ، ونحن تحولنا إلى مراعاة المصالح الإقليمية، وأصبحت المصالح الدولية نوعا ما مرتفعة، بمعنى أننا أمام تحدي تقييمي لحاضنة إقليمية وإرادة دولية. إسرائيل مفروضة علينا بأجندتها، إيران الآن تقتحم علينا مناطقنا بأجندتها، تركيا تراقب المشهد وتتحرك بمسارات موازية لمسار هذين الإشكالية أن الإرادة الخليجية الجمعية بدأت تختفي في ظل هذه المعطيات. يعني احنا رأينا مجموعة تحالفات جديدة، الشكل الخارجي لها الشكل الاقتصادي، وهذا مستوعب، ولكن لا حياة للاقتصاد إلا يكون جوهره سياسي. ثم لا يدركون هذا الأمر. إذا نحن في منطقة الخليج أمام تحدي جديد قد يؤدي، وهذا من التشاؤم، قد يؤدي إلى خلخلة المنظومة الخليجية. ولماذا خلخلة المنظومة الخليجية؟ لأنه لأول مرة الخلاف الخليجي يتحول من دوائر مغلقة للقيادات السياسية يتصالحون فيما بينهم إلى المستوى الشعبي. أصبح عندنا ارتباك شعبي وانزعاج شعبي لدى جميع الأطراف من السوءات، من الرداءة حاولت في حينها يعني أن يكون لي نوعا من الدور الإيجابي، فكنت أغرد وأحرك هذه التغريدة تحت وسم معين: الأزمة تزول والإساءة تبقى، لأن القضية قضية شعبية. تعسر سابق من عام 95 خلاف سعودي قطر، ولكن تحل المكاتب الخاصة وبين الأبواب المغلقة، قيادات الرشيدة العالية الناضجة في هذا الأمر يتفقون يهدئون يحدثون المسارات وماشية. ولكن حينما يصبح الرعاع هم من يقودون المشهد هنا جاء The problem was led by a number of demagogues who used to agitate and hurt the feelings. التساؤلات تحتاج في تقديري إلى قراءة تحليلية. يعني هل بالإمكان أن تتحول المصالحة إذا احنا سلمنا بمفهوم المصالحة من ثنائية سعودية قطرية إلى شاملة؟ المصالحة الثنائية السعودية القطرية على أي قاعدة بالذات قبل التحول؟ كيف ستكون طبيعة العلاقة السعودية القطرية ما بعد المصالحة في السياق Saudi relations be in relations with other countries like the UAE, for example. كنت أتأمل كثيرا لما جاء الدكتور نايف، لأن الشخصية الكويتية نوعا ما متنحية، ولكن إلى الآن لا زالت الأمانة العامة ستدخل دول الخليج استراتيجية موحدة للأمن بغض النظر عن الأسبوع الماضي افتتاح المقر القيادة الموحدة بغض النظر، يعني لا زال هذا الأمر يعني هذه مجموعة من التساؤلات يعني استراتيجية
Kuwaiti personalities were away.
إذا تسمح لي دكتور، فقط أنا أشير إلى نموذج من نماذج الغير اعتيادي الذي نحن نعيش الآن في المرحلة بعد المصالحة. يعني هل نتوقع مثلا من البحرين أن يكون لهم موقفا مناكفا علانية لموقف المملكة العربية السعودية من المصالحة؟ طبعا احنا نطالع اننا عقدنا حلقة بعد السنة العلا بخبراء جهات المركز، وخرجنا حقيقة بدرجة فاجأني حقيقة أن تخرج شقيقة. نعرف صحافة الخليج هي شبه رسمية وإن كانت رسمية، ثم يخرج عنوان كيف يتم إعلان اتفاق نهائي مع قطر رغم رفض التحالف. هذا غير معتاد حقيقة في السياسة البحرينية تجاه المملكة العربية. أنا يمكن أستوعب هذا مثلا من الزملاء في الإمارات بتقرير الدكتور عبدالله الخالق مثلا أو الدكتور أنور قرداش، أنا أستوعبها نوعا ما حينما قال عبد الخالق لن يتحرك قطار المصالحة مليمترا واحدا بدون علم موافقة مباركة الإمارات. يعني استوعب هذه في سياق ما. هذه مؤشرات في تقديري. أنا معذرة تجاوزت أن أقرأ هذه الورقة لأنها يعني ورقة نعتبرها مادة مرجعية أكثر من أنها مادة لاعتبار النقاش. آسف إن كنت أطلت عليكم أو أني خرجت عن بعض السياقات، ولكن حقيقة هذا جزء مما حاولت البارحة والله أن أتجاوز وأن أنام حتى آتي نشط الذهن، فما استطعت لأنه فعلا وجدت أن الأمر جدا جدا مرتبط.
ماجد، أنا متأكد أنه في أنتقل إلى حديثنا عبد الله الشايجي. دكتور عبد الله الشايجي يحدثنا على أسباب عدم المصالحة الخليجية والدكتور عبد الله الشايجي هو أستاذ العلاقات الدولية في جامعة الكويت، شغل سابقا منصب رئيس قسم العلوم السياسية في الجامعة، له العديد من الكتب والدراسات المنشورة في عدد من المجلات العربية المحكمة، كتاب أدوات التعاون العربية، الجذور، الأسباب، المساقات، وسيناريوهات. حاصل على الدكتوراه في فلسفة العلوم السياسية من جامعة تكساس في أوستن. دكتور عبد الله مرحبا، نأمل أنك تسمعنا. دكتور عبد الله، نعم. 15 ل 20 دقيقة.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, thank you, Dr. Marwan. I'm very happy to be a participant with you in this first session. And I would like to welcome the co-panelists in this session and the participants. And I do apologize for not being able to be with you due to the fact that I have a number of commitments in Kuwait. And I would like to thank the center. When we started with these forums 7 years ago, we discussed the hosting of a Gulf Studies forum, and I'm happy that irrespective of all the challenges, this forum is developing, going forward, discussing many important topics of the GCC. I would like to apologize to my colleague Dr. Majed al-Turki. I mispronounced his name in Al Jazeera program Scenario Hat. It wasn't meant to be like that. I listened to the intervention by Dr. Majed, and I do agree with so many of the points that have been underlined. So the most important theme of this paper is there a reconciliation? As you can see, we do not have any panelists from any other countries of the GCC apart from Dr. Majed. We don't have panelists from the UAE and from Bahrain. So the Arabic language is a rich language. What is happening is not reconciliation, it is not musalaha, it is rapprochement. So even the relationship that preceded the crisis have not been resumed. So there was no need for such a crisis. So as it happened in 2013, 2014, I think the crisis that has happened in 2017, I think it could have been solved by the Kuwaiti mediation, response to the Kuwaiti mediation, and this did not happen. So we have had a problematic, so we cannot have a role so if we look at NATO, for instance, so irrespective of the size of the country, if we look at NATO, for instance, Brussels, Luxembourg, they have the same weight in terms of importance as great powers such as the United States of America. So the reasons behind the crisis are not very clear, we have to say, and testament to that is the 13 conditions that have been imposed by the quartet. If we say the quartet, that means that you are with the blockaded countries. If you say the blockaded countries, you're accused of being siding with the state of Qatar. So there have been even problematics when it comes to terminologies, to alignments. So in any organization, in any council, so there should be a party that should play a mediation role. So the secretariat of the GCC failed, and because it did not come up with any initiative, the mechanisms of the GCC have not been activated. We have a dispute resolution mechanism within the council. This has not been activated. The state of Qatar has played a role that is larger than its size, and this is very important. And this reminds me of the role that was played by Kuwait in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And small countries, they always try and attempt to be a player that can play an important role, to use all its possibilities in order to play an important role. So this is part of the protection that is sought. So the countries of the region saw that the role played by Qatar should be tamed, but they failed in taming the state of Qatar for it to be a vassal state to the larger countries in the GCC. So the level of tension that we have seen was very clear. This reminded us of An-Naksa. Why have they chosen the 5th of June 2017, which is the 50th anniversary of An-Naksa and the occupation of Sinai, and also the 1967 war. So the demands, the 13 demands that have been underlined, I have detailed them in my book. So each and every demand is a violation of the sovereignty of the state. You're going to be held accountable as if you're a minor. So this is not acceptable. This is undermining the sovereignty of the state. These things are not acceptable. So the crisis was surprising. So this is my book. This is an academic book about crises of the GCC since 2011 and the alignment of Qatar, which was against the alignment of the blockaded countries. So this country is not sold in many of the GCC countries. And I try to be objective. I talked about the reasons behind the crisis. The crisis came as a surprise. So Sheikh Subah al-Ahmed, when we were in the Islamic American Summit, nobody talked about Qatar. Nobody complained about Qatar. The Emir of the state was present. The GCC leaders were in Riyadh in the last GCC American Summit on the 21st of May 2017. Nobody complained. As Trump had said, they pointed at Qatar and then he withdrew from that statement. And this is not acceptable at all when you go down to this level, when you expel Qatari citizens from Saudi Arabia, from the Emirates, from Bahrain, and when you do not allow them to enter your territory, when you disunite families. There are so many marriages between Emiratis, Saudis, Qataris. So this in itself has left an impact on the families. So also social media platforms have been used, and the use of social media was very impactful. So Twitter had a destructive role. So the GCC countries, they use they use Twitter, and the people in North Africa, they use more Facebook. So we have seen how they have come down to a very, very low level of exchange of language and a very low level of animosity, which has aggravated the impact of such a crisis that has happened as a result of this crisis. So before the crisis, before the GCC crisis, we all have been proud of the GCC as a body. In all fora, we have always said that this is the very important, the healthy body within the Arab world, but as a result of what has happened in 2010, 2011, after what is called the Arab Spring and the waves of change that have taken place. So Egypt was very much concentrating on its internal matters, the coup, and Egypt was very much concentrating on its inner affairs. The same applies to Syria, and also Iraq was dismantled. So these countries, they used to constitute the most important pillars of the Arab system. During that period, the GCC Council appeared as a constructive entity. It played a leading role in leading the Arab states until 2017, when it joined the other countries as a result of the crisis that erupted on the next day in 2017. So the GCC Council no longer stayed the most sane kind of entity in the Arab region. So what we see now is not a reconciliation, it is a rapprochement. And also this is also due to the fact that Trump was president at the time, and Trump played and contributed a great deal by not playing an active role, by bringing together the different conflicting parties. And as I have mentioned in my book, so Obama has tried to institutionalize the relations between the different GCC countries and not leave it at the level of bilateral relations between Kuwait and the United States of America, Qatar and the United States of America, and so on, up until the nuclear deal, the JCPOA was concluded. After that, in 2016, Obama came to Riyadh. 2017, Trump came to Riyadh in his first visit outside the United States of America. Since then, the GCC American summits have halted. So Trump's partiality and being against the state of Qatar, and also the intervention that we have seen and the situation that has the crisis also, and talking about the al base that has so many American armed forces, particularly air forces, and so the base is one of the important bases for the CENTCOM in the region in fighting terrorism and so on. And this includes 20 countries, and a year ago Israel became part of the CENTCOM, and it is no longer part of the Eurocom. So one of the reasons as well for such crisis is lack of accountability. The fact that there is no parliaments in the three blockading countries that would hold the prime minister accountable, as it is the case in Kuwait. So the prime minister is summoned by the Ummah Council, by the Parliament of Kuwait, summoned and questioned about what is happening, and the Shura Council elections that are taking place in the state of Qatar are a good step forward. And these are the reasons that have led to such a crisis. This is what has led to the weakening of the Arabic system in general. So the reasons behind the reconciliation, so these are not fluid, in the sense that the state of Qatar did not respond to any of the demands. So these are impossible demands. No country would accept not even one of those demands, because this is going to be against its own sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state. So after 1 month, and in the Cairo meeting that took place in July 2017, and they came up with principles. These are strange terms. They started with demands, and then they chose another term, which is principles. And in my book, I said that these demands should be not talked about, and they have to talk about combating terrorism and also combat extremism and so on and so forth. So there is no solution to this crisis unless there is negotiation. So the blockading countries, the quartet, met in the Ula summit after so many differences and problems and issues. So many rifts have happened. I think that the two main countries that are spearheading what is happening are, in the first place, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There is discrepancy in terms of the withdrawal of the Emirates from Yemen. There is a clear discrepancy, particularly at the level of OPEC and the quota of the of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So there are so many differences now of opinion and discrepancies. So the reasons that have led to such a solution: first, the attack that was made by Iran in September 2019 when they targeted Aramco. This was a wake-up call. This was a warning, a huge warning. So how Iran was successful in doing that? When they targeted the Khris and Gig installations in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. So the American intelligence talked about ballistic missiles and also drones that have been used by Iran, which has halted the production. So 5% of the production, the whole world production. Trump didn't do anything. They did not respond. So they relied on him, but he did not do anything. So this was the first lesson. The first lesson that our opinion is not taken into account, that we are not consulted when it comes to matters that are relevant to our situation. So we are like vassal states. So Glenn Snyder says there is no partnership between a strong ally and a weak ally. So you are a follower. You are either following or being abandoned. And when you see the smaller partner trying to exaggerate the kind of relationship the country is having with the stronger power. Also, we have seen the rise of Iran, its support of the Houthis as a result of the nuclear deal that was concluded, and Iran intervened in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and it was proud of that. So we have seen also interventions and interferences in Kuwait. There is a terrorist cell that was exposed recently in Kuwait. So that is why this is an opportunity to revisit this disagreement, this rift. So had Trump remained the president, would we have seen a reconciliation? No. No, Trump was a very important component in this crisis. This was the most dangerous crisis that hit the GCC since the establishment of the Council. We cannot hear Dr. Abdullah, I'm afraid, so the presenter or the moderator is interjecting to stop Dr. Abdullah. So we have so many threats that are happening. We have security threats, we have state actors threats, and also we have terrorism threats, cyber security threats, and also cyber threats. So all these components should make us revisit the situation, that we cannot deal with all these threats, particularly the level of attrition that has happened in Yemen. So when you have non-state actors, you cannot make them commit. You have seen the United States of America with the largest army, with $750 billion. They stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, and then they left because they were defeated. So the crisis is still there, the illness is still there. Yes, you try to treat the symptoms, but the illness is still there. It is still deeply rooted there. Dr. Abdullah, can you hear me? Thank you very much. So we have gone beyond the time allocated. If you would like to conclude. I have one last point. I hope that we have learned the lessons that we should have learned. This is a deep crisis with many disparities and differences even between the blockading countries themselves. Why there is no Bahraini and Emirati ambassadors in the state of Qatar. There is a Saudi and Egyptian ambassadors in the state of Qatar. There is still a cold war taking place. Al Jazeera network is still broadcasting programs and interviews where it touches upon the Emirates. So the crisis is still running, and it can happen once again. It can rise to the surface once again, but due to the circumstances on the ground and the situation with Iran, and now Saudi Arabia is negotiating with Iran. So Qatar used to be criticized for having relations with Muslim Brotherhood and with Erdogan. Now Mohammed bin Zayed recently on the 24th visited Ankara, and he was welcomed by Erdogan, and they have established an institution where there's going to be an exchange of investments of the value of $10 billion. So there is a change in the dynamism or dynamics of coalitions and alliances in the region between Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. So there's openness on all countries. And perhaps during the Q&A session, we can go into more details about it.
Now we move to our third speaker, Dr. Majed al-Ansari. Dr. Majed will be talking about the regional Arab Gulf system in the post-Gulf crisis period. He is the head of the Qatar Strategic Studies Center, and also he was formerly a professor at Qatar University, and also he got his PhD from Manchester University, and he has written extensively on the Gulf crisis. Dr. Majed, 15 minutes, please. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, thank you, Dr. Marwan, and thank you all the speakers, and Your Excellency, Dr. Abdulrahman Al-Thani, thank you for being with us. You've always been with us, participating in the Gulf studies. Now you are here with us in your capacity as Minister of Culture. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to share also my gratitude with you that after an electronic absence, if we can call it that, of about 2 years, we in academia know how difficult it is to express yourself and your ideas virtually on the internet. We always prefer to speak face to face to you, so I'm happy to be with you, and I share with my colleague Dr. Majed. I, like him, find it difficult to read my notes, so I apologize right from the start if I take too much of your time. I agree with Dr. Majed to pose a question. Is there really a reconciliation? And if so, how real is it? First, we have to respond to some questions. First, we must agree on the term of the crisis itself. In 2017, you all know the details, I will not repeat them, but the question remains, did that crisis have any grounding, any reasons, real reasons in reality, or were they consequences of regional and international developments, and therefore any solution, should it come from within the Gulf system itself or from outside it? The crisis, when it happened in fact as part and parcel of a number of developments and changes at the regional level. And please allow me to divide the post-conflict period into three circles: the intra-Gulf, the regional, and the international. And if we can analyze the situation, we can understand it better. I think my colleagues have preceded me in discussing the reasons and the consequences of the conflict, now leaving me enough room to focus on the reconciliation itself. Is there really a reconciliation, and did we really manage to confine the crisis into the certain procedures like the severing of relations, sending ambassadors back to their capitals, and the impact on the interests of these countries? These were like the forms or the features of this crisis. The first, now we have an exchange of ambassadors with Saudi Arabia. This is an important development. Now there is exchange in visits and activities. This is also a welcome development. There is more economic activity. So from a purely procedural point of view, there is reconciliation between at least Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and also between Qatar and UAE. There is an agreement on an exchange of diplomats regardless of the timings. The embassies are functional now. There are joint committees. There is also an exchange of visits. So therefore, and again, from simply and purely a procedural point of view, there is reconciliation. We have moved from reconciliation as procedural, the procedural part of it. We have moved forward. As with the actual reconciliation, we have not gone beyond the signing of an agreement and the declaration of Al-Ula summit. But from Bahrain, for example, we still don't have an exchange of ambassadors or visits or other aspects. As for how the media deals with it, I just want to focus on one thing, and that is we must go back to the pre-2017 or even before 2011. Was the relation between GCC countries so friendly that no media in any of the member states targeted negatively other countries, other members? No, I don't think so. For example, I remember that the statements carried by, even from 1968, there were criticisms in the public media in Kuwait, for example, etc. So from a political point of view, to have total empathy between the GCC countries, this has never been the norm, really. Now, the best bloc in international politics is the European EU bloc. They do not agree on everything themselves. Anyway, we go back to the three circles that I started talking about. What's to expected now in the intra-Gulf relations and the local relations between Gulf countries? Maybe the most important dossier which impacted this crisis, and that is the development in Riyadh in the Al Saud ruling family. We don't want to go into details, but that had repercussions. I think 90% of the change has been completed. There's no longer any outstanding issues. The situation is clear. even the economy and the services now are back to normal almost, and there is some sort of stability in the regime and in the system in Saudi Arabia. In Qatar also, when His Highness Amir the Father has rescinded his throne to his son Sheikh Tamim, who is the current Amir now, and also but the crisis of 2017 has hindered Qatar's efforts into effecting more reform internally, but now we see even in Qatar a more positive approach. Qatar is dealing with its internal situation, reorganizing things, elections, etc., playing a bigger and a more positive role in mediation in Afghanistan, for example, and continuing openness with many countries. At the level of the UAE, there are changes, although the changes seem to be still perpetuating and continuing. And that is to do with the nature of relations within the ruling family in the UAE, and we now find a new transformation or change. There is stability when it comes to foreign policy between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Regardless of our assessment of it, it seems that this has really led to some sort of stability in the relations between the two countries. There is a change, and it seems to be a continuous change in the UAE's foreign relations. Also in Oman there has been change, but now it seems that Oman's position is closer to Riyadh. When there was a change in Saudi foreign policy, there was a development, a positive development with Oman and Kuwait. So therefore, this confusing situation, which is like playing musical chairs, once you find an internal situation changing and impacting foreign relations and vice versa, now there is some sort of a stability which is there now, which was absent in 2017. And the biggest country, i.e. Riyadh, is opening up to others, to everyone else, and as a result, the intra-relations are an attempt to polarize relations with Riyadh. Everybody wants to attract Riyadh to their side so that it will be a catalyst for the foreign relations of that country. If we move to the regional circle, we find three main players regionally, and of course I talk about Turkey, Iran and Israel. If we accept that Israel is part of this region geographically, there are changes in these countries too. Now we moved from a situation where these countries were stable and the Gulf countries were in a state of change. Now the situation has reversed. The Gulf seems to be steady and stable. Turkey, for example, is going through change with the price of the lira and the political situation, which requires a lot of really time. And this has resulted in a change in Turkey's relations with Turkey. It's not just the Gulf countries that have changed their position vis-à-vis Turkey. It's the other way around too. And for example, Turkey is more ready now to reach out to Abu Dhabi, to Bahrain and to Saudi Arabia. Iran, on its part, are changing from a country of establishments. Now it's approaching a militarized state similar to Arab countries, and Now, after the assassination of Qasim Soleimani and Qaani now taking charge of the Revolutionary Guard, we see an absence of the traditional political class of Iran, which used to play a role in turning the policies of the Revolutionary Guard into more of a mature policy. Now we see more of a violent revolutionary positions, and also the failures in Iraq and Lebanon and others, which is making Iran more aggressive and more engaging in an attempt to prove its position and to deal with the consequences of the failure in achieving any progress in the Vienna talks on the nuclear weapons. Now it seems the Biden administration is not less enthusiastic on not engaging positively with Iran. And we see that some parts are now less dependent on Iran regionally. As for Israel, I don't want to say they have ignored these things, but even inside Israel, we see something which is almost like a collapse of the political class. We no longer see Israel exercising the same amount of influence in Washington and no more control the situation in so many countries as they used to be the one holding the strings. Now the Zionist lobby in Washington is almost unable to attract the candidates for the presidential elections. In the recent past, they failed in attracting the Democratic candidates, and also there is a shift towards the right in the United States when the center in the Zionist movement moved or shifted towards the right, and on the left they moved to the left to find that the left in the Democratic Party is taking stronger positions against Israel. 3 minutes I have. Now we see the attempt by Israel to move closer to some countries in the region is an attempt to compensate for the lack of influence in Washington. The situation now is different than how it was 15 years ago. The Arab crisis, of course, 3 minutes are not enough to go through them all, but especially when it comes to the Syrian issue, now there is a difference of positions between the Gulf countries, between those who want to keep Syria outside the Arab League or the ones who want it back in, like Qatar on the one hand and Riyadh and Kuwait on the other. We have other issues like Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, who's likely to see more confrontation maybe in the future. But anyway, finally, in the bigger circle, the multipolarism is bound to impact the situation in the world, and especially in the Gulf. And the problem for the Gulf countries, nobody can wean off the relations with Washington completely and replace it with countries like relations with countries like China, for example. Nobody can imagine that. For this reason, the Gulf countries face a real problem when the world moves into a multipolar situation again. I don't think the Gulf countries can balance the situation out between Russia and China, because both Russia and China deal with the Gulf as America's strategic backyard, and therefore they will not pay it enough attention. Finally, in conclusion, in our reading of the scene in the Gulf countries, I think we have to focus on the three circles. We cannot imagine that we can go back to a situation of sympathy and empathy, because this was only perceived in the past. This was not even there in the past, so we cannot go back to a situation which was not there. But in any event, the future will still see problems. We still see problems. Maybe Qatar can provide services to the other Gulf countries in issues to do with Afghanistan, for example. Other Gulf countries can do the same with Israel. This will continue, but we must not view this as an intra-Gulf dynamism. It is a dynamism which starts with the Gulf, but it will evolve into a multipolar system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Majed. Today and tomorrow we're going to cover most of these topics. During the different sessions, we're going to talk about the impact of GCC reconciliation and its impact on its foreign policy, and we're going to tackle the repercussions on Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, and the relationship with Turkey, and many other topics as well. We would like to move now to the last speaker in this session, this morning session, Dr. Abdullah Al-Rilani, and who is going to present an intervention. He's going to talk about GCC reconciliation and prospects of regional security. So he is a researcher in strategic affairs, and he concentrates on the foreign policies of the US, and he has a number of books and studies in a number of peer-reviewed periodicals talking about GCC security and the capabilities, and he comments on the developments in the GCC in a number of media outlets, and he has a PhD in international relations from Durham University. Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like to thank you very much. In this research paper, I used one central question about GCC reconciliation. So the topic of our discussion is the impact of the reconciliation on a number of matters, but I started with the following question. Is the GCC reconciliation, is it a strategic transformation, or is it a kind of a tactical change? So research in GCC reconciliation entails that we have to look at the roots of the crisis. So the crisis that has erupted on the 5th of June 2017, has it revealed a new reality, or has it just revealed a reality that existed? So there was a problem anyway, but this was covered with a kind of a diplomatic spirit. So the GCC crisis has not led to a new reality. It just revealed a kind of a situation that existed as in the first place. So for us to understand the details of the crisis, and then we're going to see how the reconciliation happened. So there are a number of issues that have happened. The GCC, since its establishment in 1981, was not based on a philosophical kind of framework. common joint framework. So before the establishment of the GCC and after that, the GCC countries did not agree on a common security policy or theory. There were differences between the different countries. There are who looked at Iran as a threat to the region. Some others looked at Iran as a country that should be cooperated with. So there weren't enough definitions of common strategic security methodologies that should be undertaken by the different countries as one component. So there is one article that says that they aim to reach a union, and this is a basis matter. Reaching a union entails that there should be security cooperation, joint agreements, and agreements on definitions. This is very important indeed. So this vacuum was the trait of the scene in the GCC. So there was no agreement on definitions. There were a number of issues and problems when it comes to strategic thinking within this system. So these problems have led to the crisis, have led to the GCC crisis. So hadn't there been issues, problems, ailments, if we may call them so, in the system, we would not have seen what has happened after that. So the institutions of the states in the GCC, how do they manage the state? How do they look at the local and regional realities? So these are the components that have led to the crisis. And the third thing that still is a trait. So the fact that GCC countries, many of them do not want to have a number of reforms in their constitutional systems. So these positions and not wanting to go ahead with reforms to their constitutional systems has led to the situation that we have. So this what has led to a number of parties and components that are monopolizing power and hegemony, as we have seen. So is the GCC reconciliation, is it a strategic change or is it just a tactical turn? And there are a number of secondary questions. Has this led to changes in strategic thinking methodologies? Has this led to any reforms? Because the state of Qatar has been subjected to the issues and differences. Has this led to transformations and changes? The answer is clear. Have we seen transformations and the issues of equations in the regions? So have we seen a deeply rooted transformation? So the answer is clear. No, this has not happened. So the transformation, the change that has happened, and perhaps it has contributed to speeding up the reconciliation, if we can call it a reconciliation, is the fact that the Arab Springs have lost their impact and no longer at the forefront. So because the Arab Spring was the reason behind the issues that have erupted in the GCC since 2011. So it was the Arab Spring that has led to the acceleration of the issues that have erupted between GCC countries. So the Arab Spring countries constituted a threat to the GCC countries. So the state of Qatar stood with the demands of the people, of the Arab Spring, and the other countries stood neutral vis-à-vis the situation, and the countries such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain were against what has happened. So the spark of the Arab Spring has waned, has retreated, and this has led to what is called now a reconciliation. And this leads us to the central question: is this a strategic transformation, or is it just a tactical turn? And from all these points we can conclude that this is only a tactical kind of turn, and what is feared is that there are no guarantees that this crisis might not surface again, because the level of fierceness, the level of lack of order was not expected at all. And with the absence of such guarantees and the fact that the reconciliation is closer to a tactical turn, and the fact that we lack guarantees that this situation is going to surface again, this is what we fear. So these four themes and pillars that we are supposed to look into. So we need to look at joint GCC security, and also GCC relations with Turkey, and also the methodologies that have been used in relation to the crisis in Syria, Yemen, and so on, and also normalization of relations with Israel. So when it comes to security of the region, has witnessed so many rifts and differences, but the crisis has deepened the gaps, the rifts between the different countries, and the GCC Council had almost dismantled hadn't there been a strong position by both Kuwait and Oman. The situation would have led to the exit of the state of Qatar, or Qatar being pushed out of the system. So the position of both Oman and Kuwait worked into keeping the minimum level of unity of the structure of the GCC Council, because this crisis has made countries on a bilateral relations, and this does not apply only to Qatar. Even Kuwait and Oman have started seeking the establishment of their own kind of security. The state of Qatar was under threat, and as a result of that, the Emir of Kuwait, the achievement has led to stopping a military intervention. So Oman and Kuwait were not far away from the impacts of such crisis, and the repercussions on GCC security was very apparent. And this has led to countries in the GCC thinking unilaterally about how to preserve their own security and safety. And the same applies to relations with Iran and so on and so forth. So these are the components that would delineate the security equation that we see. So we have seen rapprochement taking place, and there are a number of agreements that have not been activated. So Kuwait and Oman were in a kind of reasonable line of relations with Turkey, but Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates did not have such a good relationship with Turkey. So we have to say that this change of move and scenarios, and we cannot actually tell how the GCC relations with Turkey are going to evolve. So there are many differences. So the Syrian crisis, since its beginning, Oman did not stop its relations with Syria, but the GCC countries also differed in positions, and they supported the Syrian revolution, and after that they were no longer aligned in the same scenario, in the same position, and some countries are calling for the return of Syria into the League of Arab States. The Syrian situation does not impact the security of GCC, but the coalition of Turkey and Qatar, we have seen what has happened after the Turkish military intervention with a Qatari support. The crisis that impacts GCC security is the Yemeni crisis, and we know the level of rift and difference within this Yemeni crisis. So we have Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and we have Oman also that has kept some relations with the Houthis. It recognizes the legitimate government of Yemen, but Muscat remained the channel through which regional and international relations, and Qatar withdrew from the coalition after the crisis. So the Yemeni crisis, irrespective of its fate, this is going to lead to pivotal impacts on GCC security, and it is clear that this is going to lead to the division of Yemen. So the coalition has entered into the crisis without an exit strategy. So there is a level of embroilment where all parties in Yemen are embroiled in the situation in Yemen, and the normalization of relations is a catastrophic topic, but we have to say that the position of the GCC in general is not against rapprochement with Israel. Two countries have normalized relations with Israel. Kuwait and Qatar have linked their position to developments with the Palestinian cause. Oman has supported the Bahraini Emirati normalization, and the Saudi position is not very clear. But this is a catastrophic situation. Israel is present, and it is going to be much more present, and it would penetrate further the system, and this is going to have negative repercussions on the GCC. I would like to say that this is a kind of tactical turn and not a strategic transformation, and consequently what we fear is that this crisis might surface once again and be much more fierce than before. And this reconciliation is not going to have an impact on the 4 dossiers that I have mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah Al-Rilani. We have some time left for your questions and comments. Please make your comments or questions pointed and short and concise to enable us to take as many as we can. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for this nice event. I have a question to both Majeds, Majed al-Turki and Majed al-Ansari, regarding the Gulf crisis. The Gulf crisis, when it started, was given a popular or populist aspect, but then it was deprived of that. In fact, even at the official level, there was no celebration of the supposed reconciliation. For example, after Al-Ula summit was held and the reconciliation was declared, the foreign minister of Kuwait was honored in Kuwait, not at the level of the Gulf, as if the effort exerted by Kuwait for 4 years was in vain. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity. My question is on the central role by the GCC. Generally speaking, there is pessimism. Dr. Majed and the other Dr. Majed, Dr. Abdullah, Are we to stay forever waiting for a solution coming from the outside and to be imposed by the likes of the United States or others? Or do we really need to change our perspective, and our perspective, which was based in the past on brotherhood and mutual affiliation and affections, into one based on principles of mutual interests? We tend to focus on the negative aspects and complicating the situation rather than seeking for the positive aspects in the relations between the GCC countries. Dr. Abdullah Al-Afandi. Thank you very much, and I thank the four panelists. In fact, they were frank and they were objective. Of course, this kind of talk always leads to more pessimism, but maybe my question will be looked at as a strange. My question is about the role of Egypt. Egypt was the only non-Gulf country which participated in the crisis or was involved in it. The panelists said that the Gulf countries differed on the Arab revolutions. This is not true, actually. The Gulf countries were very enthusiastic. Saudi Arabia was enthusiastic over Yemen and over Libya. They all were enthusiastic so far as the revolution in Syria is concerned, because the Syrian regime belonged to another axis, and so much so that they wanted, or they have really armed factions of the opposition. So we really want to refocus here and to understand what has happened, and the only difference between Gulf countries was over Egypt. For example, Qatar on the one hand, Kuwait, then the other countries. Some countries thought that it was an act of betrayal on the part of the United States when it has allowed for the revolution to take place, and when the crisis broke out, the three Gulf countries were in agreement that the position of al-Sisi in Egypt was rather fragile, and they started blaming Qatar and its media for supporting the Islamists. I don't think this is true, actually. I agree with Dr. al-Ghailani in the point he has made that this is an institutionalized question, and any regional cooperation cannot go ahead without democratic regimes, because a ruler who does not give any authority to those who are below him will not give any to those who are above him either. So there was no establishmentarianism when it came to the GCC compared to the EU, for example. So therefore, any regional cooperation can lead through its very dynamics to some differences in opinion, because any situation, even if based on cooperation, can produce those who benefit from a situation and those who don't. So my question is, was the concern over Egypt was the basis for the entire Gulf crisis or not? And part of the accusations against Qatar was that it was siding with Iran. So this is not true either, and the Gulf countries who accuse Qatar of that are the ones now trying to approach the Syrian regime, who is an ally of Iran. Let us take Dr. Hassan Nafa'a from Egypt. Dr. Hassan, can you hear me? Please, go ahead, the floor is yours. First of all, good afternoon, good morning to you all. And I really hope to be with you in person. And tomorrow I have a presentation to make, but now that we're talking about Egypt and relative issues, all panelists, one way or another, alluded to the root causes of this crisis. So my question is, do you think this is a crisis to do with the Gulf and the GCC itself, or is it a crisis to do with the entire Arab system, and therefore the Egyptian aspect or dimension is very important? And in order to answer that, we must first pose a question, and I hope to get some clear answers, because the changes that have taken place in Egypt after the 30th of June 2013 led to the severing of diplomatic relations with Qatar by the other three Gulf countries. In 2014, the crisis remained as a Gulf crisis. In 2014, Egypt did not sever its diplomatic relations with Qatar, despite the change of regime has taken place in Egypt. So therefore, why in 2014 the crisis remained as a crisis between the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and UAE on the one hand and Qatar on the other, and Egypt did not take part in it, and why in 2017 Egypt got involved in the blockade? I hope to get some clear answers about this question, and if so, then we'll get a clearer understanding about whether the crisis was a purely Gulf crisis or an Arab crisis. In the name of God, thank you, Dr. Marwan, thank you all panelists. Before the start of this session, and Majed was sitting, I said to him, you are like the groom of this wedding party, and we hope to see more grooms attending this celebration. There are reasons to be pessimistic and optimistic. I'm not quite sure. Before I pose my question and my comment, I must talk about feeling optimistic. There are many indications of that. First and foremost, the presence of Dr. Majed with us, and after the exchanges and the question of the media's reaction, and also the closing down of many fake accounts on the social media, the trolls, and that. Also the visits even at the summit level by the UAE and other countries. All these indications are causes for feeling optimistic. Yet there are still issues at the level of the popular level and the level of the educated classes. Unfortunately, I'm not mentioning any country by name. Even Kuwait is not an exception. Unfortunately, the intellectual class in the Gulf countries allow themselves to be dragged into this quagmire, and maybe reconciliation will need some time. But I pose a question to our four panelists. Are we optimistic or pessimistic? Now, please allow us to give some time to respond. And Assalamu alaikum once again. I thank my fellow panelists and I thank all those who commented. It seems that the mentality is not yet ready to absorb the situation. When I said there is no reconciliation, I wasn't being pessimistic, but I was in search of a new term, because what Dr. Dhafar has said about the popular aspect of this is very important. For this reason, I started a hashtag saying that the crisis can disappear, but its impact or its impressions would last. Unfortunately, the situation moved down from the level of the political leadership to the level of the people, and this is not easy to get rid of. Now we're going through a period of media terrorism, which is even more severe than actual terrorism. I myself posted a post concerned with Saudi Arabia, and I had to spend 2 days closing down my phone because of the many calls, negative calls, people who are attacking me spontaneously, thinking that I said something against my own country. The problem we're going through now in the current phase is that making the Arab world concern itself with issues that are not pertaining to us really and nothing to do with us, because we are going through a period of change. We are exposed strategically, but we do not want to admit and see that, because the dramatic changes in the Arab world are there, but we cannot see them. Foreign intervention is there, it's exposed, but we cannot see it. I published a paper in the al-Sharq al-Awsat newspaper entitled "The Future of Relying on Arab Countries." I published that 2 months before the events in Tunisia, and in the article I said the reality between the ruling classes and the people makes me say that international powers now are bullying us, and people in the Arab world are going through periods which can only lead to revolutions similar to the colonial era, because the kind of situation we live in make people look less admirably to their rulers. First, we have a security challenge, and we face social challenges, and we are approaching a revolution. When the revolution started and the democratic change, and when the Arab world started responding to what the West has always called upon it to do, to have a popular voice calling for democratic change. I published another article. In it I said the United States will soon discover that their interests will be negatively impacted by democratic change in the Arab world. This will lead the United States to make a U-turn, and they will change their hats and they go back to supporting the despotic regime. And our brothers in Oman, I respect their theorization aspect, but it's a kind of a stagnant one because of the stagnation in their foreign policy. When an Omani admits, says that we are in contact with the Houthis, this is a methodological defect, structural defect, because when you admit that, you are stripping the Houthis of their true description of being a force which came to controlling the situation through a coup to a legitimate party. And Iran, for example, we do not cancel out Iran geographically. Iran is a neighboring country, but we still live a problem with Iran. Iran finds itself estranged between Turkish East and Arab West, and unfortunately they're doing that with support even from some Gulf countries. Our position vis-à-vis the Houthis is a position regarding Iran too. We also have a problem when we generalize the formulas we use. We cannot compare the Gulf ruling regimes with other countries, especially when it comes to the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. For this reason, the Russian media described the situation in the Gulf, and the Gulf crisis broke out, that the last oasis of stability in the Gulf. You may disagree with me. I am against the democratic changes to be part and parcel of our political system. We are not part of the Western regime. For example, American democracy, what has it given us in Iraq or in Afghanistan? All of these are lies and illusions. We just take the outside complexion and we do not understand the essence. When it comes to the media, we are defeated. I wrote something I cannot claim it to be a new theory in the media, but the United States, with all its arms in the media, whether the direct ones or the ones who act on its behalf by proxy, causes confusion. Psychologists can tell you that when you create the so-called the shock and awe effect, as when they use this CNN to do that in the Gulf War. In other words, these are details. I'm sorry I took too much of your time. Dr. Abdullah Al-Rilani. Very quick remarks. First of all, Dr. Yusuf's question on the intellectual or theoretical effort should be exerted by think tanks. I don't think we lack any of that when it comes to proposals and providing perspectives. It's all there. The problem lies in the lack of political will in the Gulf countries. The Gulf countries are full of intellectuals and theorists and ideologues who write about that, and the visions they present are enough to save the situation, but the lack of political will is the main hindrance to that. We must also distinguish when it comes to the situation or position of Gulf countries vis-à-vis Arab revolutions. I think we must distinguish between the situation of changing, replacing one regime with another. The Gulf position was not siding with Syria and Libya. It was a position taken to get rid of a regime by another. When the regime was changed, the position taken by the Gulf countries also differed between the old and new regimes. So when we talk about real democratic change is one thing, and taking a position vis-à-vis a regime which was not liked very much and wanted to be changed is another. And for this reason, in Egypt there was a revolution which led to a real democratic change which could have developed and impacted the entire Arab world, but there was a counter-revolution. And the same applies to Yemen, and I agree with what Dr. Majed has said. Who prepared for the Houthis to reach power? How did they get from Sa'da and Amran to Sana'a? How come the Houthis got where they are without anybody resisting them? And the Gulf Alliance now has entered its 7th year with all the power, the Saudis and the Emirates. Are they really incapable of getting rid of the Houthis and salvaging Yemen from them? The legitimate government controls 70% of the territory. Why don't they go back? Why don't they support the popular resistance and the people? Yemenis, if properly armed, are able to resist the Houthis and regain control of the situation. I think this is a huge dilemma. Yemen now is disintegrating, and maybe in 2, 3, 4 years at the most, Yemen will not be divided into 2 or 3, maybe even more parts. The Houthis will be focusing in the north. In the south, the Transitional Council will be in the south, and in Hadramaut and Mahra will be given to the Al-Islah, maybe another state on the Red Sea, which will take parts of Ta'az and Hudaydah. Yemen's disintegration is a direct result of the Gulf policies which led to this situation. There was a question on, was this crisis a Gulf crisis, or is it an expression of the stagnation in the Arab world? It's a bit of both. It is a manifestation of the dire situation in the Gulf as much as it is in the Arab world. Thank you. First of all, I think first we must declare that we are not responsible about what Dr. Yaqub said. As for Dr. Yaqub's expression about the importance of the popular aspect, I think this is the only This is the only positive aspect. Our role as analysts is not to we are pessimists by nature when it comes to this kind of analysis, but and on the left of social political sociology. But the question is, what if the crisis ends, but the impact on the relations between the citizens of the Gulf countries? I think what we have seen is the exact opposite. The exchange of visits between Qataris and Saudis is at a very large level. Now we see a lot of, for example, tourists and family visits, and the same thing happened with Dubai. Now on Saturday, if you go to anywhere in Qatar, any shopping malls, you find Saudi cars and UAE registration numbered cars. And so, for example, look at the sports. Once you move away from the political context, you see different. And the very fact that, procedurally speaking, now that there are no restrictions on travel now, this is very important. And also people are almost back to a normal exchange, apart from, except I think Bahrain and Qatar, and I'll need a visa to enter Bahrain as Qatari, although the opposite is not true. At the cultural exchange level, it's there. We know Dr. Majed is with it. Why hasn't this been celebrated? I think everybody was bracing themselves politically and at the popular level. Even those who tweet were waiting to see whether they should tweet or not. At the political level also, each side was waiting for the other side to see who will make the first move and what. Until now, we don't know if the political waters are back to normal or the situation is still suspect. Until now, as Gulf citizens, let's not kid each other. We all wait for a hint from above before we start making comments or tweeting in any direction. As for Egypt's involvement in this crisis, I always advise against exaggerating and blowing Egypt's position out of proportion. The disagreement was always on the revolution and its aftermath. In Tunisia was a disagreement on Sepsi, its government, and then Al-Nahda. Today is the differences on Qais Said and his opponents. In Yemen, Qatar wanted to support the Yemenis without military involvement. Saudis and Emiratis saw differently. Kuwaitis saw differently. All the Arab revolutions faced the same reactions. Egypt is part and parcel of that, and I don't think it's that different. What made Egypt take part in 2017 and not 2013 was the internal situation in Egypt itself. With the beginning of the regime change and Sisi coming to power, the system in Egypt, the regime, was still going through a period of change. In 2014, 2017, there was clear political will from the four countries to have a bigger alliance. First, they tried that with the African countries and the Islamic countries, and in the beginning, there were other people apart from the four main people. Some others got involved but changed their position. There was an attempt to expand the scope of the blockade. That has failed with almost everybody else except for Egypt, because Egypt was more ready. The first country who tried to reach out to Egypt to reach a solution with Qatar was Egypt. When Sisi visited Oman, he sent a message that the foreign minister was prepared to make a secret visit. Qataris said, no, we don't need the secret visit. If you want to come publicly, we welcome. So the whole difference was part and parcel of the internal situation in the Gulf countries. And because of the fear Gulf countries felt as a result of changes, democratic changes in the other countries, and because of that, the crisis came into existence. Finally, do we lack think tanks and intellectuals to write about this? No, of course not. Like Dr. Abdullah said, the fact that we are here, all of us talking, it means that there is intellectual productivity, so to speak. But what lacks here is the political will, because the political powers do not feel the need to listen to the Gulf, to the think tanks and intellectuals. Because if they don't feel such need, what good will all our work do if they are not prepared to listen to us? Because we, after all, do not have direct responsibility. They are the ones responsible, but definitely if there is a conduit, a channel of communication between the two parties will be very important.
So I have been listening for an hour and enjoying the discussion, but we have diverted from the main topic at some point in time. With regard to some of the points that have been mentioned, I had a question and I forgot to tell the organizers of this meeting why we don't have researchers from the Emirates and Bahrain. Have they been invited and they apologized? Or no invitations have been sent to them? And this is testament to the fact is that reconciliation is not a complete reconciliation. It is closer to trying to melt the ice or an ice melting kind of procedure. So despite all the lessons that we have learned from this dangerous crisis that had erupted and had stopped it from playing a leading role in the Arab world, are we going to accept to go back to what the situation used to be in 2017, particularly that the Charter talked about integration that would lead to a union, and King Abdullah talked about the work on a union, but now the ambitions have been dwarfed and we are talking only about going and returning to the situation that preceded 2017. Up to now, we have not, the leadership has not taken decisions. Most of the leadership has become a young leadership, so the leaders that have established the council after the late Sultan Qaboos and Sultan Al-Ahmed Sabah Al-Ahmed, those who are leading the current council, all of them are from the generation that came after. That is why do not have the affinity about the role of the council. This is what has led to the fact that crisis has continued, has protracted. So Sabah Al-Ahmed said that the council should remain because this is one of the last fortresses of joint work between Arab countries. So this organic kind of effort that is very strong. And as I mentioned, when the council was established in 1981, most of the threats were from the outside, the Iranian Revolution, the Iraq-Irani war, and so on and so forth. The only situation that has happened is what has happened in the Haram al-Makki. So this was the only matter that has happened at the time. So there are dangerous risks and threats that we all have to face. Look, there is a new mutation that has come to the surface. The GCC have now another pathway of cooperation, which is to fight the pandemic. So where is GCC cooperation lie? We do not have a pathway when it comes to economic and security and foreign and external matters. So the lesson entails that we should have a joint GCC project. We hope that we're going to have the nucleus for a project that would unify the GCC in order to face the different risks and threats. So we were in scenario hat and nobody talked about the Arab and GCC dimension for GCC security. The United States of America is not going to stay in the region. It is retreating, it is waning its presence in the GCC. So before the 9th of 11th and before the liberation of Kuwait, there was a lower presence of the security of the American presence. So we are downgraded in the favor, on the interests of China, Russia, Asia, and we have seen these transformations that have taken place. And we have to understand, we have to start planning to know what is the nucleus for a GCC project. We do not have a monetary unified kind of policy, and sales tax policy has not been imposed by both Bahrain and Kuwait. In Saudi Arabia, it is now 15%, and Oman has added 5%. So we do not have interoperability. We do not have joint weaponry systems. We do not have a missile joint system. We do not have an early warning system amongst us. So we do not have all these things. So Iran has asymmetrical warfare capabilities. It has the ability to target water installation, water desalination facilities. So we do not have any of these capabilities, and we do not have any joint efforts in this regard. So what is the lesson? Are you strong? Do you have military capabilities? Saudi Arabia is inclined to buy weapons more than Russia. So nobody is going to fill this American vacuum. Nobody can do that. So do we have an understanding as to how deep this crisis is? So this is a pivotal question that is not clearly and seriously and frankly and directly discussed. The second point, if we have enough time, you have 1 minute, Dr. Shayji, talking about optimism. This is not a matter of being optimistic or not optimistic. We have to be realistic. The reason that have led to this GCC crisis and the blockade that has happened with Egypt. And Egypt, instead of it leading, it is being led instead of it So Qatar has not done anything to Qatar, to Egypt. What is the problem of Qatar with Egypt? With the exception of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi. So Egypt has lost its leading role, but unfortunately, it has become a vassal role, a vassal state. It is not leading. It is not a matter of optimism or pessimism. It is a matter of realism. We have to be realistic here. So the reasons that have led to the eruption of the crisis are still there. So the state of Qatar did not respond to any of the demands, to any of the principles, and the blockading countries had to accept the reality. So the fact of coming closer was not going to solve the crisis. And also another crisis is the absence of institutions. This is a big problem. So after 40 years, so the council is not a council of institutions. So we have an absence of reconciliation. We have a lack of a dispute resolution committee, and this is something that we feel very much concerned and sorry for. So there is a lack of seriousness vis-à-vis the situation. All parties relied on Trump. That is why the situation protracted and continued for some time. And also, we have had a number of think tanks that stopped inviting this party, thinking that this is partial to this side or to that side. And many, many intellectuals from the 4 GCC countries that were part of the crisis, they played a role that was not helpful. So all of them fell into the same situation. So all of these are very, very important lessons, and it would be sad if we do not understand these lessons, if we do not understand them seriously, in order to transform the GCC that has so many potentials and capabilities to be a shield, a nucleus for a GCC council that would stop and deter Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah Al-Shayji. We have come to the end of this session. The time is up, but we have the second part of this session. We're going to take a 15-minute break. I do apologize to you, but you can pose your questions in your coming session. We're going to have a parallel session. We're going to have 2 sessions that are going to be held after the coffee break. So the response of the Gulf states to COVID-19 policies and implications. So 15 minutes and then we resume once again. Thank you very much.